Let us summarize. Before anybody ventures into anywhere in the deserts, basically, first of all, avoid high temperature days. Check the weather in advance. If if there is high temperature, just stay home. Um, don't hike into high temperatures. Bring adequate water. Make sure, even in the correct temperature, make sure you don't venture anywhere without navigational redundancy. 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 The repetitive nature of our words is to emphasize redundancy. Make sure you have navigational redundancy. Make sure that you have an offline GPS navigational system installed, ready, and usable on your mobile cell phone. And also make sure that you have, in addition, a physically separate GPS unit. Make sure that on your physically separate GPS unit to mark the coordinates of where you start out from, which for most people today is going to be from where they park their vehicle, or wherever they are starting out from on the trailhead. Basically, make sure you mark multiple waypoints, set your routes. Basically, you might mark multiple waypoints, redundancies, but essentially, at least make sure, at the very least, where you parked, at the trailhead, or if there's no trailhead, whatever start off point you are, make sure you mark those coordinates to test those coordinates to make sure that they're right. And then make sure you have a high capacity battery recharging system. Make sure that you validate and test all charging cables. Make sure you have the correct cables for your GPS unit. Make sure you have the correct cables for your mobile phone. Make sure that the cables, even if correct, are tested and validated. Sometimes sometimes I bring a spare cable, and I think a spare cable is essential, but basically validate those cables. Make sure you have at least 2 navigational redundancies. Mobile phone with offline GPS navigational tracking, physically separate GPS unit. Make sure you have the correct cables for those 2 devices. Make sure that you have, again, make sure that you have a high capacity recharger. Make sure that you bring enough water. And basically, land navigation is important. Basically, an adequate compass, an adequate topo map that has the basically any necessary adjustments in terms of the declination. So basically, where true north may or may not differ from magnetic north, where the needle points to, depending on your location on the Earth. But basically, we want to address the next point here. The over experience can kill. All right, this is a less talked about aspect, and this is the main point here. But we want to hammer down the essentials. I think there's probably people guilty of this, but basically, over experience is a killer. Someone has been a hunter all their lives. Someone knows an area like the back of their mind, like their front lawn. Over experience creates confidence, and confidence can actually be fatal and deadly. It's kind of like the Titanic effect, okay? If someone has a lifelong career in the wilderness, they grew up in some backcountry backwoods, they grew up there, they've been lifelong hunters. Well, there's been cases where people who know an area intimately have vanished for apparently no explicable reason. But we have identified certain aspects in those cases where there were no navigational redundancies. There were There were cases where there were no adequate redundancies. There were cases where there were no adequate supplies, no adequate communications. Um, you have had cases where people who are highly knowledgeable of an area, uh, with say a 30-year history of revisiting the same area, then they vanish. Okay, so overconfidence is one thing that the experienced need to mitigate against also.